stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You may be seated. I'd like to start this presentation off with a question. What does it mean to be an American? Although a strange question, this is something that I've asked myself over a dozen times throughout my life. You see, as a fifth-generation Crucian, born and raised on the island of St. Croix in the USVI, I grew up never questioning my American identity. But as soon as I moved to Louisiana, everything suddenly changed. Even after telling people I was from the United States Virgin Islands, the kids at school would constantly question me, asking me things like if I really had American citizenship, what it was like immigrating to the US, and how I knew English. Eventually, their questioning of whether or not I was really American made me question the same thing. You see, even though I knew I was an American on paper, I didn't see myself reflected by our flags or our maps, and I grew to believe that being from a US territory instead of one of the 50 states made me somehow not American at all. But why is this the case? What are the US territories? How is life living on one of these islands? And most importantly, why should you care? Today I'm going to answer these questions, telling you all the story of the 5 stars missing from our nation's flag. The 5 US territories that have been ignored by our country for decades. But in order to understand this, we must first take a journey through history to understand where we started. The year is 1898, and the US has just declared war on Spain following horrific news reports of abuses against their colonial revolutionaries in Cuba. Deemed the shortest war in US history, the Spanish-American War lasted less than a year before America claimed victory, and its resulting treaty transferred power over not just Cuba, but also Spanish-controlled Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the US. Gaining these territories was a huge win for the US government, as the land served to both economically and militarily benefit the nation. However, with the addition of these islands came the issue of dealing with the people who lived on them. And to put it bluntly, most Americans weren't a fan. The non-white islanders were too different for Americans. They were foreigners, uncivilized. They had different cultures, customs, beliefs, and to many, they simply weren't fit to be American. So, what do we do when their land is our land, but we don't want to accept them as being part of us? Introducing the Insular Cases. Now, the Insular Cases were a series of 1901 Supreme Court cases regarding the US's new territories. In these cases, the Supreme Court ruled that residents of the new US territories wouldn't be protected by the full Constitution, allowing the government to cherry-pick what rights these new Americans would get, or, more importantly, the ones they wouldn't, like citizenship and voting. The decision was heavily based in bias, with the court directly referring to territorial inhabitants as alien races and savage tribes, in their rationale that these people wouldn't be able to understand Anglo-Saxon law and therefore need not be protected by it. The cases, which the American Civil Liberties Union deems as based squarely off the presumed racial inferiority of the people living on these islands, set a precedent of second-class citizenship and marginalization that still impacts the over 4 million Americans living in the US territories today. Do you remember the first time you ever saw a voting booth? I do. It was lunchtime in 5th grade, and there are a few of them stacked in the corner of the cafeteria along with a Vote Here sign, probably left over from the 2016 election. At the sight of them, nobody around me batted an eye, but to me, they were the coolest thing in the entire world. I was 10 years old and so excited over voting booths because voting in federal elections was something my family had never gotten to do before. In fact, a US territory is the only place in the entire universe where US citizens can't vote in federal elections. If you were to move to a foreign country or even go to space, you would still be allowed to vote using a mail-in ballot. But as soon as you move to a US territory, this fundamental American right is immediately stripped from you. Not only that, but those living in the territories have 0 voting representatives in Congress, regardless of the fact that federal legislation directly impacts them and their livelihoods. This lack of representation is arguably the worst for American Samoans, who, despite the 14th Amendment, have never been granted citizenship rights, and for this reason can neither vote in nor run for public office in the states. American Samoan Sai Timoteo found this out the hard way, after being disqualified from running for the House in Hawaii, later expressing that growing up, she learned about our freedoms and always thought she had the same right to participate in our democracy. She never knew that her ethnicity as an American from American Samoa granted her second-class status and denied her rights that so many Americans take for granted on a daily basis. And Timoteo is right. Living in a state rather than a territory grants you privileges that you probably never knew other Americans are barred from. Not just in regards to political representation, but also things like economic support. For example, programs like Medicaid, TANF, SSI, and SNAP were created to provide support to the most disadvantaged Americans throughout the nation. And yet those living in the territories, despite being amongst the most impoverished in the nation, are often ineligible to receive support solely due to their place of residence. When Puerto Rican Jose Luis Valle Maderno moved back to Puerto Rico from New York to take care of his wife, he was sued over $28,000 by the federal government for using the same SSI disability benefits he had been using for years, since SSI didn't apply to those living in Puerto Rico. But why should poor and disabled Americans not be able to receive support from our federal government? Why should American voters be turned away at the polls because they don't live in the right part of America? Why should I have to feel like I can't ever move back from where I come from without sacrificing a future in my dream career of politics? Why should any American be made to feel as though they are lesser than, as though they aren't American at all? Let me take you back to my opening question. What does it mean to be an American? Now, I don't have any deep philosophical response to this question. The answer is probably just what you would expect. An American is a native or resident of America. However, it's time we open up our eyes to the America outside just the 50 states. At the end of the day, America is one of the most diverse nations in the world. And this is a fact that we should encourage, not shy away from. As Americans, we have a duty to ensure that our democratic principles are being upheld for all. We shouldn't stand for constitutional rights being a luxury rather than a guarantee. We shouldn't keep in place laws rooted in racial biases. We shouldn't deny any American a say in the laws that impact them, and most of all, we shouldn't stay silent in the face of injustice. In 1900, former Secretary of State William Jennings Bryan said in regards to territorial residents that if we are to govern them without their consent and give them no say in the taxes which they must pay, then we dare not educate them, lest they learn to read the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States and mock us for our inconsistency. Well, surprise, surprise, we can read, and the mocking has already begun. In 2021, the former Attorney Generals of Washington, D.C. and Guam wrote in an op-ed that denying Americans equal constitutional protections does not comport with our fundamental values, saying the struggles of territorial residents must be included in the broader fight for justice because every American is deserving of equal protection under the law. In 2023, a dozen civil rights organizations wrote to then-President Joseph Biden urging him to publicly condemn the Insular cases, calling for their immediate overturning, and yet, despite efforts, real change has yet to occur. And in my opinion, this standstill is due to a lack of knowledge. Raise your hand if you can confidently name all 5 of the US territories. Yeah, the lack of hands raised is exactly what I expected. But it's not entirely your fault. In many ways, the US territories are hidden from even Americans themselves. They don't get a star on our flag. They won't show up if you search up a map of the US, and they aren't taught about in schools. So how would you know that they exist? But while they say ignorance is bliss, it can also be dangerous. So I urge you all not to be ignorant. Change can only happen if we make it happen. Every week, when we sit in this very room for announcements, we pledge allegiance to the flag of a nation that promises liberty and justice for all. But we're the ones responsible for ensuring that the nation keeps that promise. We get to create a society where nobody feels like an alien in their own nation. A society where everyone has equal rights. And a society where this little girl never had to question her place in the nation she had the privilege of calling her own. Because at the end of the day, only we can ensure that America stays true to the values that make it the land of the free and the home of the brave. Thank you.